Thanks, Kathy, and thanks for the invitation to present today. Thank you all for coming. My accent, by the way, is Dutch, if anyone wonders. I've been in Tasmania for the last 9 years now, starting as a lecturer in the school. So I teach 4 units in GIS and remote sensing, in geography and surveying and spatial sciences undergraduates. So when most people hear the word drone, they think about US defense drones that are used for surveillance, reconnaissance, and even these weaponized drones. And I straight away want to steer away from that because there's a lot of controversy, there's a lot of negative media about these. And on this slide you can see what other drones are out there, and they're all called drones. I mean, a drone is really just a sort of a buzzword for this technology. So drones can be absolutely tiny, as large as insects. Drones can be like glorified aerial tractors, like the Yamaha RMAX here. So there's 2,500 of these in use in Japan for crop spraying, spraying of rice paddies. So it is literally an aerial tractor and widely used. This is NASA's drone, so it's essentially an ex-Air Force drone that they use for surveillance, and it can stay up in the air for over 50 hours and cross the Pacific. So my project, Terra Luma, is sort of started about 4 years ago, and it originally started because I had a need to sample at a very high resolution, spatial resolution, and I sort of had a need to put a sensor in between the ground and satellites, in between the ground and manned airborne surveys. And so I started looking at these little hexacopters and octocopters that had just come out about 4 to 5 years ago. And they were quite expensive when they came out. And so one of my colleagues said, well, we can do that very cheaply. We just buy a hobby remote-controlled helicopter and stick a camera on it. And we very quickly discovered that it became a very powerful scientific sampling tool. So just to clarify, we're not a robotics group. We're a group in geography and environmental studies, and our main expertise is in sensors and image processing and applying these images to solve real-world problems. So we sort of fill a niche in Australia when it comes to this type of research, in that our key focus is on using this technology to solve real-world problems in environmental mapping, environmental remote sensing, agricultural mapping, and high-precision aerial surveys. So our key focus is on the sensors. And from a scientific perspective, these 3 points are the key advantages. The spatial resolution of the imagery that we can acquire is phenomenal. So just to give you an example, the sort of currently available satellite imagery, the highest resolution satellite imagery available is in the order of 50 centimeters for a pixel, which is incredible when you think that these satellites are in orbit at 700 to 800 kilometers above the Earth's surface. They can observe something about that big. However, for a lot of applications, we need more detailed imagery. Especially in agriculture, think about vineyards, think about orchards. A 50 centimeter pixel, you'd be from one end of the vine to the other, and you'd get lots of contamination from soil underneath. So there is a need in many applications for higher resolution imagery. So that first point is important. So we collect data at sort of 1 to 10 centimeter resolution, and I'll show you some examples today. Another one is the temporal resolution. So satellites are in orbit, and they pass over maybe every 4 days to every 2 weeks, depending on the satellite. So if we're at a critical stage in the growing season, for example, we might need data right now to make a decision on irrigation or pesticides or whatever it might be. There might be cloud cover, so when the satellite passes over, all it can see is clouds. So the nice thing about UAVs is that we can go out at any time, provided the wind is not too strong, and we can collect the data ourselves, even under cloud. And finally, this is something we sort of specialize in, is that we can fly multiple sensors, and I'll show you some of these examples today. So a very brief overview of the platforms that we've collected over the years. We started literally with hobby remote control helicopters. These are used for fun, for stunt flying, and we essentially built these sensor mounts out of aluminium and pool noodles. Very high tech. We then, a couple of years later, upgraded to this octocopter, which is called a multi-rotor helicopter. It's very stable because of its 8 arms. It has an autopilot, so it can actually take off and land by itself, and it can fly to pre-programmed GPS waypoints. It still amazes me when we operate, because it literally does its own thing. It flies by itself. There's a stabilized sensor mount, and it means that even though the octocopter is sort of buffeted in the wind, it will try to keep the sensor level, so pointing down. And then in this particular case, we can mount a standard consumer-grade digital SLR, a multispectral sensor as shown here, and a thermal sensor. And I'll cover some of these sensors and examples of applications later. We upgraded to a slightly bigger octocopter, and it can fly for a bit longer, and it's more robust, and it can carry more weight. So it can carry heavier sensors. Last year we got an even bigger octocopter called the Skyjib to carry about 5 to 6 kilos. So every time we get a new sensor, we basically want something more, and more means more expensive and bigger to either get a higher resolution or basically better quality sensors. And that means that we need to be able to carry more. These multi-rotor helicopters are great, but they can only cover fairly small areas. So a typical flight lasts 5 to 10 minutes, and in a flight we can cover about 2 to 4 hectares, which for a lot of agricultural applications just wouldn't be good enough. So for experimental plots, that's fine, but for larger areas we need to look at other platforms like these fixed-wing UAVs. And this is a great example of technology, I think. This is a foam plane, about 2-meter wingspan, that you can buy for about $400 to $500. And we recently bought an autopilot that is an open source autopilot for $200. When we first started, we bought an autopilot for 10,000 Canadian dollars, fully licensed, export licenses, and it took months to get here. When it arrived, it was very difficult to make it work. It crashed one of our helicopters, and that turned out to be a known bug. It was all very annoying. 2 years later, there's an open source community. We've developed a $200 autopilot. We installed it in this plane. We were in a rush and didn't read the instructions and thought, oh, well, we'll just try. And we flew around on the uni farm at Cambridge here, flicked the switch, and it just performed beautifully out of the box. So electronic developments like that have made our life a lot easier, because we're interested in the applications, we're interested in the science, in the remote sensing. We just want these things to fly and work. We don't want to spend days and days configuring autopilots, because we're not in that business. Anyway, so these planes have become quite cheap and easier to fly, and they allow us to cover larger areas. So this is our largest fixed wing. It can carry about 8 kilos, and this gets quite serious, because you need about 100-meter mowed strip or runway, and it weighs about 20 kilos, flying at 100 to 120 kilometers an hour. So that gets quite sort of dangerous to operate. But really it's all about these, the sensors. So what can we do, what can we learn about the environment using these sensors? So I'll talk you through some of these, but really it all started with a compact camera. Since then we've acquired multispectral, thermal, hyperspectral, lidar, and a few others. So I'll sort of talk you through them. So this is a multispectral imaging sensor, so that means it can acquire images outside of the visible range. And in a minute I'll explain why that is important, but essentially it can tell us much more information about plant health. So if we want to know if a plant suffers from stress, whatever stress, biotic stress or abiotic stress, we really want to image it outside of the visible range. Because inside of the visible range means that we just take an image, just like what we see. If a leaf turns yellow, it's often too late. So we want to be able to capture stress before we can see it in the field. And so we're trying to make the invisible visible using these type of sensors. So this is an example of what a near-infrared image looks like. And this is the Cambridge University farm that we use as a test ground. Does anyone know what this is? Sorry, salt? No. It's poo. Lots of cow dung there, all piled up. Anyway, these are a lot of these are the eucalyptus trees there, the sort of quite young eucalyptus trees, and you can immediately see just by the differences in color that there's quite a few different species there. In a visible image, that would all look quite green, and I'll show you an example of a crop in a minute. We also have a hyperspectral scanner, and instead of collecting imagery in 6 bands, we can collect imagery in a continuous continuous spectrum. So the principle of a hyperspectral sensor is that it essentially detects the incoming light from the sun. So the sunlight bounces off the Earth's surface, objects on the Earth's surface, and inside this hyperspectral scanner it hits a prism. And the prism splits that white light into individual wavelengths. Behind the prism sits a sensor, just like the sensor in a camera, that then records those individual wavelengths. It does that for every single pixel in the image. So for a pixel in the image, we get a continuous spectral signature. This spectral signature is like a fingerprint. It essentially tells us a lot about the sort of biophysical, biochemical composition of whatever is in this pixel, which could be a plant, a tree, a bit of soil, minerals, whatever we're interested in. So in the context of vegetation, it will allow us to separate different plant species, and it will allow us to tell us something about the pigment composition, the water content at the sort of leaf and plant level. Okay, so it can tell us much more about the sort of the health state of vegetation compared to a simple snapshot. So this is an example of why spectral information is so useful. So the incoming sunlight consists of all these different wavelengths. They hit the top of the leaf, and in the top of the leaf the green light bounces back out. The red and blue light is absorbed, and that's what a plant uses to photosynthesize. The near-infrared light reaches deeper into the leaf structure and reaches the mesophyll, and it essentially bounces off the chlorophyll. So the amount of near-infrared light that is reflected off a leaf is indicative for its chlorophyll content. And that's quite a nice characteristic. So I'll show you an example of a leaf. So this is a ficus leaf. If we leave that out to dry and measure the spectral composition of that leaf at each 10 minutes, we start off with this bottom line here. So lots of blue, it absorbs lots of blue, reflects green, absorbs red. So it's a nice healthy leaf, photosynthesizing. We can see that it's green because it's reflecting green, but look at the near infrared. If our eyes would be sensitive to near infrared, vegetation would be sort of very, very bright. It would be glowing in the dark almost. So what's happening here is that that leaf is essentially drying out. It's losing chlorophyll, and you can see that the spectral signature is changing every 10 minutes. The water is evaporating or transpiring from the leaf, and it's starting to lose its chlorophyll. So that spectral composition, that fingerprint, is completely changing. Now, so this is a laboratory setup. It's an experiment with a spectrometer over the top of this leaf. Now, what we can do with our hyperspectral instrument is essentially derive these spectral signatures for every single pixel. So we can fly over a crop and determine how healthy each of these pixels are when it comes to vegetation health. Alright, I'll give you some practical examples in a minute, but the powerful aspect of hyperspectral remote sensing is that we can derive maps of chlorophyll concentration, leaf area index, which is a biomass measure, canopy water or water content, and so on, crown closure, soil fraction. So lots of biophysical, biochemical characteristics of the surface. Another instrument that we have is a thermal camera, and this is an example of a snapshot on the corner of the oval. So this is the sports oval, close to sort of Clark Road and Grosvenor Crescent, and this is the corner of the geography building, and you can see a couple of people there drinking a cup of tea. It's very, very small and light, and it's another example of recent advances in technology. The final sensor that I want to cover today is a laser scanner. So it's a laser scanner that was designed for high-end BMWs and Audis for obstacle avoidance. So you can see them in the grille of these cars, and they're designed to scan ahead and basically detect obstacles for automatic braking. So we've taken that laser scanner and installed it on one of our octocopters so that we can scan the terrain from above, and we use it for forestry applications and several other things. Positioning is very important. So one of the receivers that we use is a very, very accurate GPS receiver. So a lot of people are familiar with GPS nowadays. It's global positioning technology. So your iPhone or your Samsung Galaxy or whatever, your iPad has a GPS built in, but for us that's not accurate enough. The positioning of these devices is to within 5 to 10 meters. We want centimeter accuracy, and that means we need a different type of GPS technology. So with these small receivers we can get to within 2 to 4 centimeters absolute accuracy at about 20 times per second. Small data loggers, so everything needs to be small and lightweight. So we're using these small gum sticks, embedded computers with a version of Linux running on it. And this is certainly not my background, and I found this absolutely fascinating, to start with a scientific research question and sort of be forced to learn about all these things, to actually make things work and make them fly and collect data and ultimately address these different case studies. So over the years we've looked at scanning of 3D trees in 3D. This is the Houston's lettuce farm, Vineyard, salt marsh mapping, coastal erosion mapping. That's the Savage River open cut mine, stockpile scanning, deformation of landslides, and moss beds in Antarctica. And the list of applications sort of keeps growing. So today I want to focus on the agricultural trials that we've gone through. So starting at the Cambridge farm in the barley crop, so which is under center pivot irrigation, and there's the octocopter at about 100 meters above the surface. So this is one of the multispectral images. And what we're looking at here is the reflected near-infrared light. So we wouldn't be able to see this with the naked eye. And what you can see is these bright sort of purpley red patches. That's healthy barley, with a lot of chlorophyll reflecting all that near-infrared light. You can see a bit of erosion going on with some sedimentation in these gullies, and the weeds really stand out as well, those bright dots. This here is a much drier patch with sort of bare soil coming through. We can turn this into a vegetation index and essentially map vegetation health. So blue is unhealthy and red is very healthy in this case. This is an experimental trial that Tina Acuna was involved in. I can turn that off. So this example really sort of demonstrates the power, I think, of multispectral imagery. So the trial is here, the barley trial, and this area has had twice the amount of nitrogen or fertilizer as this area here. So there's sort of 3 blocks next to one another, so no fertilization, standard rate of fertilization, and double. So you can see that there's something going on. The barley here has sort of fallen over and is flat on its side. But when we visualize this in the near-infrared, you can see how much more or how much better we can differentiate. We can turn this into a vegetation index, and those very healthy barley areas really start to stand out. Interestingly, in the thermal, on a sort of warm summer's day, it shows that the healthy barley is nice and cool, whereas the sort of less vigorous barley is a lot warmer. So in the thermal imagery, that also stands out. Talking about thermal imagery, when I was preparing for this presentation, I found this image on one of the websites of a thermal sensor company, and I think it really illustrates what we can do with thermal imaging. So this is not from a UAV; it's full-scale airborne. It wasn't collected by us, but it shows the effect of irrigation under a center pivot. And it shows that some of the nozzles, like this one here, wasn't working very well. Must have been blocked. So you can see it straight away in the thermal, whereas you probably wouldn't be able to see it from visible imagery. So very rapid assessment of the impact or effect of irrigation. So that's another one there. You can see how this ring is a lot hotter. Another one is that weeds really stand out. So these are flowers, and we could even sort of automate the process of identifying weeds. And this is another example of a poppy crop. So you can see how spatially variable this crop is. And potentially we can identify areas where the crop isn't doing so well, and provide that information to a farm manager or agronomist. And with variable rate irrigation, we can sort of regulate that application of water spatially over the crop. So I think that sort of high-resolution information, hopefully provides a good source for managers to take that information and help decision making. Okay, so this is a flight over the Houston's lettuce farm. It shows the 3D flight path of the octocopter, and it's a full 3D model of one of the areas. So it's a 2-hectare area, and the nice thing about this study here is that we didn't have any sort of ground control points in the field. So for a lot of the previous work, we had to be in the field with an accurate GPS receiver to tie the images down to field level. In this case, we designed this system with a standard camera logging very accurate GPS coordinates. So this is a map of the farm, 2 hectares, or an image of the farm. And when we zoom in, you can see the individual lettuces. We can start to pick out where they're not doing so well. So diseased lettuces clearly show up. So we can automatically create maps of lettuce circumference, for example, and map where the lettuces are not very healthy. We can see, identify areas of inconsistent growth, identify areas where the planting pattern is not consistent. So I think they're meant to be planted in a hexagonal pattern, and that didn't go so well on this strip here. So in terms of accuracy assessment, so I'm in a group of surveying and spatial scientists. And spatial accuracy is always important to us. Some of my colleagues work with high accuracy GPS, and they're after millimeter precision. So what I'm showing here is this is a ground control marker about this round, about this size, 20 centimeters, and the cross should be in the middle. So it shows that we're about 10 centimeters off target, but this is without sort of any information input from the field. So it means we can fly over a crop, over a paddock, and produce maps and produce products that are accurate to within about 10 centimeters. And our more recent results have brought that back to about 2 to 3 centimeters. From this overflight, we were also able to create a 3-dimensional model, a digital surface model. And from this model, we can derive things like topographic wetness index. So this is a simulation of where water accumulates. So it's not measured, it's modeled. And what it allows us to do is essentially work out where irrigation water or rainwater is going to end up. So you can predict areas of waterlogging, for example. So these are one of these spatial data sets that might also be useful for further decision making. This technique also works on plowed paddocks. So with very little structure in the actual paddock, we can derive full 3-dimensional models just by collecting images. Which is an interesting technique. So the other day I was talking to Ruben Wells, who runs AgLogic, an agricultural consultancy company, and he's certainly very interested in this technology because he advises a lot of farmers on the use of center pivot and variable rate irrigation. And one of the critical aspects of setting the system up is the lay of the land. Where are the depressions? Where are the the drainage channels? Because it's important that you don't pump too much water into these areas, otherwise you get waterlogging. So he was very interested to know that with UAV technology we can fly over an area and simply take lots and lots of overlapping photos and produce these full 3D models. We've also done some viticulture trials with the Two-But Spur Vineyard at Gardener's Cove and Frogmore Creek. And this was an initial trial to look at how multispectral imagery and thermal imagery, can be used to assess vigor. So this is a multispectral image, and what you can see the rows of the vines, and you can see that the soil underneath in that sort of light blue. But the problem here is that the grass in between the rows is also very vigorous. It's healthy grass because it's irrigated as well. So how do we separate the vines from the grass? So this is where sort of the image analysis comes into play, and with a vegetation index called the photochemical reflectance index, we can emphasize photochemical photosynthesis essentially from the multispectral image. So what you can see here is that the vines really stand out. You can see some of the leads, and that allows us to map vigor and produce a map of vigor. Again, on a warmish summer's day, the vine rows themselves are quite cool, and the soil underneath is a lot warmer. And you can see this is on the right-hand side. That's a much drier area of the vineyard, and it also shows up as much warmer. For larger areas, as I said, we can deploy these sort of fixed-wing aircraft, and with fixed-wing we can cover perhaps 25 to 100 hectares or more in a flight, and that really opens up opportunities for a typical crop or a typical paddock. So this is the same area in false colour. Again, the Cambridge farm, and I think Tia has some experimental plots here looking at salinity and the impact of salinity. Okay, so just in the last sort of 5 minutes, this is one of our more recent experiments, and it's we're basically the first team in the world to fly a hyperspectral sensor on a multi-rotor helicopter like this. And what we can do with that is collect very, very high resolution hyperspectral imagery, from which we can derive products like chlorophyll content, biomass, and so on. So the integration of this sensor became quite technical, and this is really where you need people like in the engineering workshop and CSL and electronics engineers to make this possible. This was quite nerve-wracking because it's probably about $60,000–$70,000 worth of equipment suspended from this helicopter. So you can imagine taking off for the first time is pretty scary. So this was our first experiment, again on the uni farm. So this is the barley crop in the background, and we're essentially flying a transect over this bit of grass, across the fence and into the barley. That's just a tape measure to work out whether the flight strip was straight, and these are a bunch of reference targets at different brightness levels. So hopefully this will play. So this is literally the very first flight. And this was manually flown, and that's why it's still quite wobbly. It was quite a windy day. And sort of more recently, we've flown it with the autopilot, so that the flights are a little bit more stable. But yeah, you can see how windy it is in the barley there. So as it is motoring along, it's essentially building up an image. So it's scanning a single line at a time. So as it's flying along, it's building up this image. So what I just want you to remember is this tractor track here. because we'll see that show up in the image in a minute. This is not the octocopter sort of flipping upside down, this is just the camera going up. And this is essentially the resulting image. So as it's flying, it's building up this strip, and that white line in the middle should be straight. So that was a little bit of a disaster, but to my surprise, the actual spectral signature looked absolutely fabulous. So spectrally, the signals are very, very strong. We cut out a good portion of the image, and this is where you can see that track to track. This is the fence, and this is the bit of tape measure. And so for each pixel in the image, we get this full continuous signature. And as I said before, the blue and the red is indicative for photosynthetic activity and sort of pigment, the concentration of pigments, and that's the reflectance of near-infrared. So what we can derive from this is products and map these products, like the chlorophyll content, which is an indication of health, and LAI, which is an indication of biomass or yield, depending on what crop you're looking at. So ultimately, this is what I envisage for sort of future work. We should be able to fly over a crop, a much larger area than this obviously, map a whole farm, or at least a whole irrigation circle, for example, and produce map products that people like Ruben Wells or farm managers can use to provide advice. Sorry, I'm not sure why that's still in there. I'll skip this. So some of the future focus. So to get there, I think that fixed wing is the way to go, but it should be easy to operate. So we should be able to literally throw it in the air, so no sort of expensive launches or anything like that. In the next phase, I'm keen to look at small devices that can all be crammed into a single UAV. So we can collect visible, multispectral, thermal all at the same time, create 3D models, and essentially produce a whole workflow, from raw data to mapping products within 24 hours. And I know that this is doable, but it needs a bit more research and a bit more funding. Rigorous sensor calibration. Creating pretty pictures is one thing, but we need to validate the products that come out of this analysis. We're after biophysical, biochemical products, not just pretty pictures. Furthermore, I'm already exploring collaborations with several staff in TIA, including Kathy and Karen Berry and Marcus Hardy and Richard Rawnsley and others. But with the merger between our schools, I'm certainly keen to explore these opportunities further. So one of these is pasture management in the northwest, which is a project with Richard Rawnsley and others, and hopefully that will be supported by, or further supported by SenseT. With Kathy looking at viticulture and things like frost mapping potentially, and vigor mapping using UAVs. And I've been talking to TES Alkaloids and GSK about the use of this technology in the poppy industry. So those are three sort of tangible projects that I think UAV technology can really help. So I'd like to thank a whole bunch of people, the members of my team, funding bodies including AIC and the Australian Antarctic Division, philanthropic organisation, University of Wollongong, and the workshops here at UTAS. And if you'd like to find out a bit more about the project, there's a website called terraluma.net. So thanks for coming this Friday afternoon, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Arko. That was really illuminating. Just while you're reflecting on the, just while you're thinking of the questions that you want to ask Arko, I just want to jump in and ask you one quickly while I've got the opportunity. In a lot of our work in agricultural science, so you've given us a whole suite of wonderful new tools for measuring different variables. And so often when we develop our models, and everyone, you know the old concept y equals mx plus c, so we have an independent variable explaining the dependent variable. So I see we've got a lot of ways of measuring x. I think the next challenge is relating that to our dependent variable y. So I'm just wondering if you can, and is one of your challenges is to talk to us to work out what, you know, you might be able to measure leaf area index, but then we have to find out then what we relate that to, whether
exactly, yeah. So that, I mean, that's one of the issues I'm facing now. Like, I can generate all these products, but they might not all be relevant. And you might be after a certain mapping product that requires different sensors and different sensor products. And to come up with a reliable workflow, we need to collaborate and we need to validate these products based on field observations, field sampling, comparing physical samples, measure them in the lab, and compare them to the mapping products that we generate. And I think that's very important. So this is certainly work that I'm involved in Antarctica, looking at Antarctic moss beds. A completely different application area, but I'm working with biologists and ecologists who sample the physical structure of the mosses, their water content, their pigments, and they physically sample, and we compare those derivatives from with our observations. So the dependent variable was moss health, and we generate all these different data layers that might allow us to map moss health spatially, in a spatially explicit manner.
Any other questions?
You pull a lot of that data out in the modern combine, which is almost sort of an RTK GPS and yield map. It's one way I've been fiddling with it, trying to pull it all together a bit better. I think the biggest limitation we've got right now is the resolution in our pivots for variable rate. And the average pixel size of that's 50 by 50 metres. Actually getting a tail end to pull it all down.
Yeah.
So the variable rate per, it's 100 by 100 square metre, typically with the Amazon systems.
Yeah.
We're just not getting front talking to the back.
Right.
Bloody, triple or the worst for locking down the code.
Yeah, so I'm aware of things like green seeker technology that sits on the center pivots. Look, a lot of that technology is very similar, and it uses spectral signatures, and it uses ratios of near infrared and red and green and so on. I think one of the unique aspects about this technology is the field of view, that you can cover much larger areas at great detail, and especially when we start talking about the combination of thermal, hyperspectral, and so on. But certainly there's a lot of overlap between what's already out there and some of this.
I'll say this is what you need. You need to go out, throw a wing in the air, 20 minutes later, download.
Yeah.
Put it in, go and put it in urea.
Yeah. And that's, I think, where it should be going over the next few years. It should be a workflow that results in mapping products within a few hours.
I was just thinking before, we really need more growers in the room. Obviously, whether you're a grower and a scientist, but that's exactly the sort of. We need to get to a user-centered design and all of these things to really understand what the needs are of the ground.
Yeah.
Over larger areas, how would we compare economy to man flights?
Sorry, can you speak up a little bit?
Over larger areas,
Yeah.
how would the economics of this compare to actual manned flights?
Manned flights, yeah. No, that's a really good point. So, at the moment, we don't have a sort of a commercial pricing model, because it is a research project. We are certainly interested in commercialization, and for this to become commercially viable, you'd have to have a good business case. You'd have to do market research. A manned flight is very expensive. We've done some manned flights on the West Coast, $700 an hour, and it's a very small Cessna. It's nothing special. So helicopter flights, you're looking at $1,200 and up an hour. So depending on where you are, where the farm is, it can get very, very expensive. Yeah, so here we have the driving time, of course, and the special expertise to launch these things. But I think the key advantage is that we can operate in a wide range of different conditions, and we can fly much lower. In fact, we have to fly much lower. Legally, we have to fly below 120 meters, and above that is regulated airspace. And that's what gives us the very high resolution imagery. Yeah. So I see, you know, it's not like UAVs are the answer to everything. I think they just fill a scale niche between field and manned aircraft. If you need to map 2,000, 4,000, 10,000 hectares, you know, hire a plane. Yeah. Yes, I'm not sure. It's an interesting question. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Look, we have generated imagery at 2 to 3 millimeter resolution, but that was flying at 20 meters above ground level. So that's only 20 meters up. But yeah, probably not far off. What would you like? What would you want to image? Right. Yeah. 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 I have to think about that one. Thanks.
I'd like to ask a couple of simple practical questions. If we take your equipment to the university farm again to look at that barley crop, what would be the setup? I've got a couple of questions that will follow on. I won't ask them individually, but you can ask them at once. Setup time for doing infrared scans, looking at moisture and so on, looking at chlorophyll, looking at lip area index. Setup time. What is the maximum wind speed that you can tolerate to scan a 2 hectare paddock? And the other thing is, have you worked out the standard errors for the estimate of LAI on those different bands that you talked about on your scale?
Okay. All good questions. So the setup time is typically half an hour. We can operate in winds up to 25 knots, but that gets quite iffy. We have done at the uni farm, and it is quite a windy spot. The wind sort of channels through that valley, and it just means, you know, the octocopters are certainly able to navigate, but we find that they sort of navigate to a waypoint, and they get there, and they reduce power, and they get blown away and try to get there again. So it becomes very sort of the flight path it gets blown all over the place, basically. But anything under 15 knots is fine. Your last question about sensitivity and standard deviations on LAI estimates. The results that I showed of the LAI map were based on an empirical study in Europe. So it was an equation derived from a 2012 remote sensing of environment paper, and we haven't done a formal validation experiment here in Tasmania yet. So I'm very keen to get a PhD student on on the poppy project, for example, and properly validate this with field samples. Yeah, and that's certainly what's needed.
I'll just take one last question.
That links directly to my question, because having access to that type of technology could fundamentally change our experimental design. Because in the past, obviously, we designed our experiments around the technology that we had available.
Yeah.
So that might enable us to do larger scale experiments much more cheaply, and also then take different types of measurement than we did in the past. Have you thought about how it might actually influence that aspect of it?
Well, it's certainly something that I'm interested in the context of this poppy projects, for example. So my initial my initial project design was going to be to scan the whole farm for terrain and soil variability. Based on the variability, select transects, small transects of about 50 meters long by 10 meters wide, and use those to fly the hyperspectral fly to get to basically cover the variability in the crop. And within these transects, sample say 2 square meter areas or 3 square meter areas, and sample them over the gradient of that variability, so that we can link the field samples to the flight strip and then upscale to the whole crop. But I mean, that certainly needs I think closer discussion.
I mean, that validation of traditional measurements of a lot of those parameters will become very important.
Yeah, yeah,
So
certainly.
very keen
Yeah.
to see that. I also have a question on the commercial aspect of it. Have you spoken to the Hobart City Council? and I'm asking that because I had a surveyor out at our place today who could have done with technology like that.
We had an agreement in place with Lester Franks, which is a local surveying firm, for stockpile scanning.
Okay.
We've done a couple of jobs, but nothing sort of regular. And we're in conversation with a company from the US, a robotics company, who want to commercialize our lidar product. So we're certainly talking to the research office, the commercialization people here, and exploring ways to commercialize some of our IP. Yeah, it's a tricky one though, because a lot of the commercial people want us to apply for patents, and we want to publish. So, but it's not necessarily mutually exclusive. No, no, no.
On that note, I'd like to thank Arko very much for coming and
Thank
sharing
you.
your illuminating topic with us.
Thanks.
And certainly making things happen, especially with those images of those cow cats there. So
Yeah.
thank you so much.
Thank you.